In the remote valleys of Appalachia, far from the eyes of civilization, dark tales of families forgotten by time lie buried like secrets no one dares to uncover. This is the story of Elijah Blackwood, the most disturbing patriarch of West Virginia, who married two 16-year-old nieces, a man whose legacy of perversion and control warped generations of a family into victims of their own corrupted blood. Between 1927 and 1978, within the rugged mountains of West Virginia, one of the most unsettling family dynasties ever recorded in the region took shape. Elijah Blackwood was born in 1897 in a secluded valley of McDowell County, raised in a world apart where geographic isolation molded not only daily life but also the relationships among the handful of families living there. The Appalachian Mountains have long been known for sheltering isolated communities. In the early 20th century, many lived with virtually no contact with the outside world. Roads were rough or non-existent, and families relied entirely on themselves to survive. In this context of extreme isolation, marriage customs considered taboo elsewhere sometimes became a quiet reality. Elijah was the eldest of 8 children. His father, Thomas Blackwood, was known across the region for his domineering nature and the severe methods he used to raise his children. Elijah's mother, Sarah, was Thomas's second cousin, an arrangement not uncommon in those isolated communities at the time. The family survived through subsistence farming and hunting, rarely venturing down to the larger towns in the valley. When Elijah turned 18 in 1915, his father sent him to work in the coal mines beginning to open across the region. This was his first real contact with the world beyond the isolated valley of his upbringing. There, among the miners, Elijah encountered different people and ideas, but he also grew a sense of superiority toward outsiders. He became convinced his family lineage was purer and that people from beyond the mountains were inferior. In 1918, after 3 years in the mines, Elijah returned to the valley following an accident that left a deep scar across his face. The isolation that followed only intensified his controlling tendencies. When his father died in 1923, Elijah, then 26, assumed the role of family patriarch. It was during this period that his behavior began to show troubling signs. He exercised absolute control over his younger siblings, particularly his sisters Margaret and Eleanor. In 1925, he arranged the marriage of Margaret, then 22, to Jeremiah Tucker, a man 15 years her senior who lived on neighboring land. Elijah's condition for the marriage was that the couple remain on Blackwood land under his watch. The next year, 1926, Eleanor was also forced to marry, this time to a distant cousin named Robert Harris. Again, Elijah insisted they live under his roof. So began what would later be called the Blackwood Compound, a cluster of cabins and structures where Elijah kept the entire family under his domain. Between 1927 and 1930, Margaret gave birth to 3 daughters, Ruth, Hannah, and Abigail. Eleanor, in turn, had 2 daughters, Esther and Mary. Elijah took a disturbing interest in his nieces, often interfering in their upbringing and imposing strict rules for their education. At the time, the geographic isolation of communities like the Blackwoods meant there was little to no outside interference. Schools were too far to attend regularly, and authorities rarely visited these remote corners. This seclusion allowed Elijah to cement his power over the family without question. As the girls grew, Elijah increasingly restricted their contact with the outside world. They did not attend school and were taught at home, mainly by their mothers and by Elijah himself, who instructed them in a twisted version of family history and the supposed virtues of keeping their bloodline pure. It was in 1943, when Ruth and Esther turned 16, that Elijah's truly disturbing behavior came to light. That year, his sisters' husbands, Jeremiah and Robert, died under suspicious circumstances. Jeremiah in a hunting accident, Robert after a sudden illness. Though no formal investigations occurred at the time due to the isolation, later accounts from younger family members would suggest the deaths were orchestrated by Elijah. With his sisters widowed and completely dependent on him, Elijah announced he would marry Ruth, his niece and Margaret's daughter. The ceremony was held privately at the compound itself, no official registration, no recognized religious authorities present. Margaret, dominated by her brother for years and fearing for her safety, could not oppose. Just 3 months later, in an even more shocking display of depravity, Elijah declared he would also marry Esther, Eleanor's daughter, his other 16-year-old niece. This second marriage was carried out in the same clandestine manner. It's important to understand the historical context. In the 1940s, though marriages between uncles and nieces were illegal in West Virginia, authorities rarely monitored isolated communities. In remote regions where civil records were scarcely kept, such laws had little practical effect. In the following years, Ruth bore 4 of Elijah's children, 2 boys and 2 girls. Esther had 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls. It was in this first generation born from these incestuous unions that the genetic effects of consanguinity became evident. Of the 7 children, 5 had significant health problems. 3 had visible physical deformities, including fused fingers, syndactyly, spinal issues, and facial malformations. 2 others showed what was then called mental disability, now understood as significant intellectual impairment. In the 1950s, the isolation of the Blackwood compound began to lessen as road construction reached further into the region. In 1952, an itinerant doctor visiting remote communities to offer basic care came upon the Blackwood family. Horrified by the conditions, especially the state of the children, he tried to alert authorities. However, at that time, government intervention in family matters was far more limited than today. Mountain families were also known for their distrust of outsiders. When county officials finally visited, Elijah presented falsified documents claiming Ruth and Esther were wives from neighboring communities, unrelated to him by blood. The women, terrified after years of abuse and manipulation, confirmed his story. The initial investigation was closed, but the case caught the attention of Dr. Charles Montgomery, a physician with a growing interest in the emerging field of genetics. In 1954, Dr. Montgomery obtained permission to examine some of the compound's children under the guise of a rural health program. In notes that would only surface decades later, he documented the health problems he observed, noting the high incidence of congenital defects and correctly suspecting they resulted from close consanguinity. He wrote, "The patterns of anomalies observed in the Blackwood children are consistent with what scientific literature describes as the result of close consanguinity. It is alarming to consider the conditions that may have led to such a situation." Despite his suspicions, Montgomery faced resistance from both the family and local authorities. In Appalachian communities of the 1950s, family matters were considered private, and there was cultural reluctance to interfere even amid evidence of abuse. Meanwhile, inside the compound, conditions worsened. Between 1955 and 1960, 5 more children were born from Elijah's relationships with his nieces. Of these, 3 died before their first birthday due to multiple health complications. Infant mortality was not uncommon in impoverished rural areas then, so these deaths did not immediately raise suspicion. A turning point came in 1962 when Hannah, Margaret's second daughter and Ruth's sister, managed to escape the compound at age 33. After witnessing years of abuse, she undertook an arduous 3-day journey through the mountains until she reached the town of Welsh, where she reported her story to local authorities. Initially met with skepticism, Hannah had lived in isolation her entire life and struggled to communicate. Her claims were eventually taken seriously thanks to Thomas Ricks, a young social worker new to the county's social services department. In October 1962, Ricks organized an official visit to the Blackwood compound, accompanied by 2 state police officers. What they found was deeply disturbing. The compound had grown to 6 main structures housing about 30 people, all under the control of 65-year-old Elijah. Living conditions were deplorable. Children, many with obvious health problems and disabilities, lived in extreme poverty and neglect. Some of the teenagers and young adults, children of Elijah's unions with Ruth and Esther, showed clear signs of consanguinity, including distinctive facial features like receding jaws, prominent foreheads, and closely set eyes. Even more alarming, Ricks discovered evidence that Elijah had begun initiating relationships with some of his own daughters, his grandnieces, perpetuating the cycle of abuse and incest. Faced with the evidence, authorities finally acted. Elijah was arrested, along with 2 of his older sons who had become accomplices in controlling the family. The women and children were removed for medical and psychological evaluation. The court case that followed in 1963 was unprecedented for the time and region. Elijah faced multiple charges, including child abuse, illegal confinement, and incest. Held behind closed doors due to the sensitive nature of the accusations, the trial revealed disturbing details of how Elijah had maintained control. For decades, he had crafted an almost religious belief system, convincing family members the outside world was corrupt and dangerous, and that only by following his rules could they remain pure and safe. Physical isolation combined with psychological manipulation had allowed his reign of terror to persist across generations. Medical experts testified about the physical and psychological effects of prolonged incest. Dr. William Patterson, a geneticist from the University of Virginia, explained to the court, "What we observe in the younger members of the Blackwood family is consistent with the phenomenon known as inbreeding depression, the manifestation of harmful recessive genetic traits due to breeding between closely related individuals." He detailed how, in normal populations, harmful recessive genes rarely cause issues because a person usually inherits one healthy copy from the other parent. But when close relatives have children, the chance of inheriting two copies of the same harmful gene increases dramatically. The evidence presented included an infant mortality rate among Elijah's descendants of roughly 40%, compared to the then national average of about 2%. A significantly elevated incidence of congenital malformations, including heart defects, cleft palate, and skeletal abnormalities. Widespread intellectual disability, with nearly 70% of the living children showing some degree of cognitive impairment. Severe immunological problems, making children extremely susceptible to infections. Reduced stature and delayed physical development in almost all descendants. A particularly disturbing aspect revealed during the trial was the so-called founder effect within the Blackwood lineage. This genetic phenomenon occurs when a new population is established by very few individuals from a larger population, resulting in reduced genetic diversity. In the Blackwoods' case, generations of consanguineous marriage had made certain rare recessive traits common in the family. One notable example was a rare form of polydactyly, extra fingers, combined with syndactyly, fused fingers, creating a distinctive hand malformation affecting nearly 30% of the compound's children. Elijah Blackwood was found guilty on all charges in December 1963 and sentenced to life imprisonment. He died in Moundsville State Prison in 1978 at age 81, apparently showing no remorse. The fates of his victims varied. The adult women, including Ruth and Esther, then 36, faced enormous challenges adapting to life outside. Having been subjugated and manipulated their entire lives, many struggled with mental health issues, including what would now be diagnosed as complex post-traumatic stress disorder. The younger children were placed in foster homes or, in the most severe cases, in specialized care institutions. Follow-up records show that even those without obvious physical deformities often developed health problems related to consanguinity later in life, including reduced fertility, autoimmune diseases, and rare metabolic disorders. In 1970, 7 years after the trial, West Virginia University began a longitudinal study to follow the Blackwood survivors. Continued until 1985, it provided some of the first systematic data on the long-term effects of prolonged consanguinity in a human population. Among its significant findings was the persistence of genetic issues even in individuals who appeared physically normal. Many survivors who had no visible anomalies still carried multiple recessive mutations that could affect their own children if they partnered with someone carrying the same recessive genes. The study also documented a surprisingly high prevalence of certain rare disorders among Blackwood descendants. For instance, Usher syndrome type 2, which causes deafness and progressive blindness, was identified in 8 family members, a rate hundreds of times higher than in the general population. Another revealing aspect was the pattern of neurological development. Even children without significant intellectual disability often showed atypical cognitive development, including specific difficulties with abstract reasoning, spatial processing, and executive function. These findings contributed to the growing understanding of neurology's genetic foundations. The legacy of the Blackwood case extended beyond the family. It impacted child protection policies in West Virginia and nationally. The case was cited during 1970s legislative debates on strengthening child protection laws. When the U.S. Congress passed the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act in 1974, creating the first federal child protection program, the Blackwood case was mentioned as an extreme example of how isolation and lack of oversight can allow abuse to span generations. Scientifically, the case offered valuable data for behavioral genetics. Though modern ethics would prohibit such studies, the data collected from Blackwood survivors, with appropriate consent, helped clarify the complex interaction between genetics and environment. For example, among siblings raised in different foster homes, those who received early, intensive educational intervention often far exceeded expectations based on their genetic profiles, demonstrating environment's powerful role. A less discussed aspect is the case's impact on Appalachian communities. For years, the Blackwood story was sensationalized by media, reinforcing negative stereotypes of mountain residents as inbred hillbillies. This unfair portrayal obscured the region's complex social and economic realities. Later demographic studies showed consanguineous marriage rates in Appalachia were not significantly different from other rural American areas during the same period. What made the Blackwood case exceptional was not the cultural context, but the extreme, deliberate abuse by a deeply disturbed individual. In 1982, a PBS documentary titled The Children of the Shadows revisited the case, interviewing adult survivors who consented to share their stories. The documentary was groundbreaking for its sensitive treatment and for giving voice to the victims. One impactful interviewee was Sarah, daughter of Ruth and Elijah, who was 12 when the compound was discovered. At 31, she had overcome tremendous adversity, born with a spinal malformation that limited her mobility and facing significant learning challenges. She had finished high school and become a disability rights advocate. In the documentary, she reflected, "People ask if I hate my father. The truth is, I barely remember him as a person. He was more like a dark force over us. What I feel is sadness for what could have been." Another survivor, Michael, son of Esther and Elijah, was 8 when rescued. He had no serious physical anomalies but lived with a rare blood disease. He spoke about the shame he initially carried. "For years, I didn't tell anyone my past. It was only in therapy that I realized I was a victim, not someone to feel ashamed." Understanding the science behind what happened helped, knowing our health problems had a rational explanation, not a curse, as Elijah told us. The psychological impact on survivors ran deep. Many struggled with identity, self-esteem, and forming healthy relationships. Those who later had children described intense anxiety during pregnancy, fearful that their father's sins would affect their babies. The Blackwood story also raised questions about how societies care for survivors of extreme trauma. In the years after the compound's discovery, the institutional response was fragmented. Children were separated not only from abusive parents but often from siblings, adding more trauma to already devastated lives. Not until the 1970s did more holistic approaches emerge, recognizing the importance of preserving sibling bonds and providing specialized therapy for abuse victims. In 1978, the year Elijah died, a group of adult Blackwood survivors formed an informal support group that later became the New Roots Foundation. This nonprofit, still active today, educates the public about child abuse and consanguinity and supports individuals from similar backgrounds. It also works with medical communities to raise awareness of the specific health needs of people with histories of family consanguinity, helping professionals identify rare conditions for earlier intervention. In 1985, Dr. Robert Jenkins, a geneticist who worked extensively with the survivors, published an influential study in medical genetics clarifying mechanisms by which prolonged consanguinity affects health. It identified over 30 rare genetic conditions in the Blackwood family, many virtually unknown in the general population. Jenkins noted, "What makes the Blackwood case scientifically significant is not just the extent of consanguinity, but its directed nature over generations, creating a tragically revealing natural experiment on the effects of inbreeding in humans." Among surprising discoveries was a previously unknown genetic variant affecting vitamin D metabolism, contributing to high rates of rickets and skeletal deformities in Blackwood children. This finding later advanced treatment for certain forms of vitamin D-resistant rickets. As survivors reached adulthood in the 1980s, new challenges emerged. Many faced difficult decisions about having biological children. Some chose not to, others sought extensive genetic counseling and prenatal testing, then a nascent field. In 1992, nearly 30 years after the compound's discovery, a remarkable reunion took place. 17 adult survivors, many separated since childhood, gathered in Charleston, West Virginia, to share stories and celebrate recovery. Organized by New Roots Foundation, the event was private, offering a safe space for reconnection. One participant later said, "It was like finding pieces of a puzzle I didn't know were missing. For the first time, I was in a room full of people who truly understood." The Blackwood legacy continues to reverberate. In medical genetics, decades of data contributed to understanding recessive gene expression. In child protection, the case remains a stark lesson on the dangers of isolation and the need for community vigilance. For Appalachia, the story is a reminder of resilience against not only poverty and isolation, but also against damaging stereotypes. Perhaps the most important legacy lies with the survivors themselves. Many transformed trauma into strength, becoming social workers, nurses, teachers, and advocates. As Rebecca, a granddaughter of Elijah who became a child psychologist, expressed, "For a long time, our family was defined by the darkness my grandfather created. But that's not our complete story. We are also defined by our survival. Each time I use my experience to help a traumatized child find hope, I feel I'm rewriting a bit of that history." In 1998, when the last formal follow-up study concluded, researchers noted something remarkable. Despite tremendous genetic and psychological adversity, a surprising proportion of survivors had built stable, often extraordinary lives. The final report stated, "Perhaps the most important lesson from the Blackwood case is not about the consequences of consanguinity, but about the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to transcend even the most traumatic origins when given adequate support and opportunity." The case of Elijah Blackwood remains one of the most disturbing documented examples of family abuse and manipulation in American history. It is a dark tale of how isolation, combined with one individual's domineering will, can breed generations of suffering. But it is also, ultimately, a story about healing and redemption against the odds. In the words of one survivor, Elijah believed he was creating a dynasty with him as supreme ruler. Instead, his legacy is a warning about unchecked power and unsupervised isolation. If anything positive emerged, it's the determination of so many of us to ensure nothing like this happens again. Today, the mountains of West Virginia are far different from Elijah Blackwood's time. Roads reach remote valleys, the internet connects isolated communities, and child protection systems are more vigilant. Yet the Blackwood story endures as a powerful reminder: the most terrible abuses can occur not only in city shadows, but under the open mountain sky, where silence and isolation can conceal the most disturbing human truths.